This week it will come into sharp focus at the United Nations as the Palestinian Authority seeks to a universal declaration of statehood from the United Nations. Well, joining us now to discuss this complex, nuanced and ever-changing issue is a man that lives it day to day, Israel's Foreign Minister Avigdor Lieberman. Mr. Lieberman, thanks for joining us today. Your deputy, Danny Ayalon, recently took a step that I found fascinating as Israel tries to explain its position to the world. Put out a series of YouTube videos on the peace process, on the West Bank, on the history of all this. It seems to go over what, for people that follow this issue, should be some very basic information. Why did you feel that necessary, considering how often and how much this issue is discussed in the news media?
First of all, I think that there are many misunderstandings regarding the Middle East. When you ask me about the peace in the Middle East, what's your intention? It's a peace in Iraq, it's a peace in Egypt, in Syria, in Libya, in Yemen. We have a lot of conflicts and problems and frictions in the Middle East. Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it's maybe less than 2% of all victims and bloodshed in the Middle East. Only during the Iran-Iraq war were killed and injured more than 1 million people. And the first Gulf War and the second Gulf War, what was the bloodshed that we see now in Syria. And if I try to compare the relations between us and the Palestinians to the situation in Libya, in Yemen, in Syria, we really keep the situation under control. The biggest misrepresentation and misunderstanding in the world that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is the heart of the Middle East issue. And I think that everybody who looks today on the map sees that there are no links, no ties between uprising in Tunisia and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The clashes in Yemen and the situation in Libya and the Israeli-Palestinian friction, the situation in Bahrain, in Syria. And I think that we must understand that the real problem of the Middle East, it's not Israeli-Palestinian relations. It's first of all the deep change that necessary to bring to the Arab society within Arab world.
So that's the Arab Spring.
I'm not sure that it's Arab Spring, but
what was called the Arab Spring, and that was what I was going to ask you. A lot of people were optimistic when the uprisings began in Tunisia, in Egypt. I remember being in Washington when President Obama, in February, when President Obama was speaking on this, and he was calling for democracy, a flourishing of democracy. Are you still optimistic? Have you ever been optimistic about the way things will turn as it relates to Israel?
No, I don't believe that it's possible to impose in an artificial way a successful democracy. First of all, for democracy you need a strong middle class, and I don't see the strong middle class in the Arab world. In Israel, you know, I'm proud to be Israeli. We had big demonstrations and protests in the center of Tel Aviv with 400,000 people, without any violence, without any fear that somebody will shoot as a protest. And I think that it's the same in Canada, in Scandinavian countries. The base of the flourishing democracy is the middle class. In the Arab world, they must create this middle class, because the main reason for uprising now, it's really a misery and poverty, the disparity between some oligarchs on the top and the poverty among 90% of population.
This week, though, and I understand what you're saying about the Israeli-Palestinian issue being a small part of the overall conflict that's happening throughout the region, and you're absolutely correct. But this week it's coming into focus because of what's going to happen at the United Nations. From your point of view, what is happening? Is it a good thing? is it a bad thing that Mahmoud Abbas of the Palestinian Authority will ask for unilateral declaration of statehood?
First of all, it's a glaring contradiction to the Oslo Accords. We signed Oslo Accords 18 years ago with Palestinian Authority, and the document and the spirit and all our understanding during these 18 years was that Palestinian state will establish only as a result of direct talks between Israel and the Palestinians. We recognize two-state solution, and we, from the first day of this government, we're ready and we call for the direct talks. But the Palestinians prefer to avoid direct talks and go through international community. And I think today it's more clear that it's a personal project of Mahmoud Abbas, because in his age he thinks today only about his future, his destiny, his legacy, his place in history. He saw the destiny of his close friends like Ben Ali in exile, Muammar Gaddafi, his main political patron Mubarak in the cage in court in the...
So he's seen what's happened with these, and he's...
Egypt, and he thinks what his political legacy, what his place in history, and he prefers his political legacies and the destiny of his own people. The problem is that we don't have one Palestinian Authority. De facto we have divided entity. We have Hamastan in Gaza Strip, we have Fatah land in Judea and Samaria. When we asked Mahmoud Abbas what with the strikes from Gaza Strip on southern Israel, and we suffered more than 12,000 missiles and shells on our southern Israel, he says, it's not my responsibility, what do you want from me? I'm not in power there.
Okay.
But today, when he goes to the UN, he represented, of course, all the Palestinian people.
I want to ask you about the split between Fatah and Hamas, what you will do if a unilateral declaration happens. But first we'll take a break. We'll be back. More with Israel's Foreign Minister Avigdor Lieberman in a moment. Welcome back. This week the United Nations will deal with the question of whether the Palestinians should receive statehood through a vote at the United Nations, rather than following up on the declarations, the accords they signed, including the Oslo Accord in 1993, one signed directly, in fact, by Mahmoud Abbas, the current leader of the Palestinian Authority. Joining us to talk about what this means from an Israeli perspective is Israel's Foreign Minister Avigdor Lieberman. Mr. Lieberman, before the break you were saying that Hamas rockets come from Gaza, they land in Israel. You go to Mr. Abbas and say, what are you going to do about this? And he says, it's not my responsibility. There is a split between Hamas and Abbas. Hamas has in fact come out and said they don't support this and they want all of the land.
Of course. First of all, you know, it's also important to understand that Mahmoud Abbas postponed 3 times the elections in Palestinian Authority. The last week he postponed again the local elections. And the question why? Because it's clear for him that Hamas will win the future elections.
So is this partly about a power play, internal Palestinian politics, this bid for the UN? Is Hamas waiting in the wings to take the West Bank as well?
Of course, you know, the same story like with Gaza Strip. If you remember, disengagement process was exactly the same. We passed the responsibility for the Gaza Strip to Mahmoud Abbas, and we evacuated 24 flourishing settlements, and we transferred more than 10,000 Jews, and he took the responsibility for the Gaza Strip. And a year and a half after, Hamas won the elections, and they took the power in the Gaza Strip. And the same today, they keep their silence. They are waiting for unilateral decision for the Palestinian statehood. And after some time they will take the power in Judea and Samaria the same.
If the vote goes to the General Assembly at the United Nations, it is most likely it will pass. If it goes to the Security Council, I believe you hope the Americans will veto. What do you do if it goes to the General Assembly? If there's a vote at the General Assembly and they say statehood for the Palestinians, what's Israel's reaction?
You know, maybe before our reaction, what it's impossible to understand. Let's imagine if we will agree to go back to the 67 line and to divide the Jerusalem. What will be on the next day within Israel, in Tel Aviv, in Jerusalem, in Herzliya? I think that we will be in the same situation like with Gaza Strip. I think that 90% of Israelis understand the same fact. Our reaction to the unilateral decision will be very strong. I'm not sure.
Strong how?
I'm not sure that it's necessary today, you know, to start with threats, with the details, what will be our reaction. But I can promise only one thing, that it will be a very strong reaction. I think that we want to create opportunity for, you know, comprehensive and reasonable approach, and I think that there is a place for some new decisions from the Palestinian side. And I spoke with all Europeans and Americans, and everybody understands that it's a very bad direction. It's a precedent for other parts of the world. If it's possible to move forward with unilateral decisions regarding the Palestinian issue, what will be with Cyprus, with Kosovo, with Bosnia, Transnistria, etc. And everybody looks and what will be the real, the final decision of Palestinian leadership. And I still prefer to wait some days, and we will announce our new approach, new policy only after the final decision in General Assembly.
Okay, so you don't want to get into how you'll react, but can you understand who you would be dealing with if this goes through? You've got Fatah and the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. You've got Hamas in the Gaza Strip. Mahmoud Abbas has not won election. He lacks legitimacy in that way. Who do you deal with?
You know, we have the same reality in Gaza Strip without Mahmoud Abbas, without Palestinian Authority, and we know how to deal. And I think the same situation in Judea and Samaria. We have enough partners. We know how to deal even without Mahmoud Abbas. And we're ready to this option also.
Do you and your government still believe in a two-state solution?
Yeah, we announced, and the Prime Minister gave a very significant speech after the elections, very long speech. The first time that the right-wing government recognized two-state solution, and we're still there.
All right. We're talking about the ongoing situation at the United Nations, the Palestinian attempt for unilateral declaration of statehood this week at the General Assembly. Talking with Israel's Foreign Affairs Minister Avigdor Lieberman. This week it will come into sharp focus at the United Nations as the Palestinian Authority seeks to a universal declaration of statehood from the United Nations. Well, joining us now to discuss this complex, nuanced, and ever-changing issue is a man that lives it day to day, Israel's Foreign Minister Avigdor Lieberman. Mr. Lieberman, thanks for joining us today. Your deputy.
And frictions in the Middle East. Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it's maybe less than 2% of all victims and bloodshed in the Middle East. Only during the Iran-Iraq war were killed and injured more than 1 million people. And the first Gulf War and the second Gulf War, what was the bloodshed that we see now in Syria. And if I try to compare the relations between us and the Palestinians to the situation in Libya, in Yemen, in Syria, we really keep the situation under control. The biggest misrepresentation and misunderstanding in the world that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it's the heart of the Middle East issue.
How much this issue is discussed in the news media?
First of all, I think that there are many misunderstandings regarding the Middle East. When you ask me about the peace in the Middle East, what's your intention? It's a peace in Iraq, it's a peace in Egypt, in Syria, in Libya, in Yemen. We have a lot of conflicts and problems.
Danny Ayalon recently took a step that I found fascinating as Israel tries to explain its position to the world. Put out a series of YouTube videos on the peace process, on the West Bank, on the history of all this. It seems to go over what, for people that follow this issue, should be some very basic information. Why did you feel that necessary, considering how often and how